Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Bird. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Traceable, and today's session is titled, You Can't Have Zero Trust Without API Security. The learning objectives for today's session are pretty simple. Now, first, we're going to discuss the fundamentals of zero trust, myth versus fact, or fact versus fiction. Next, we're going to have a discussion about the challenges with zero trust in the cybersecurity industry, the implementation, deployment, as well as the strategic framing of zero trust within organizations today and the challenges that many companies are facing. And finally, why zero trust must include API security and the API layer for complete data protection. What I'd really like to do before we dive into APIs and the security of APIs and its relevance to zero trust is talk about zero trust at a higher level. So a little bit of my background, I spent 20 plus years in the corporate world. I've been in the solution side of the equation for about 5 years. I'm a bit of an odd quantity in the solution space in the fact that I've both been a chief information officer in the corporate world as well as a chief information security officer. I came through IT operations in the early days of large scale digital processing for middle office and back office in the banking industries, and then I switched my career tracks in technology to information security. And moved through roles such as the global head of identity for JP Chase into a chief information security officer role for a Swiss analytics device company, and then moved out of the corporate world into the solution space specifically because my hope was that I would be able to have a greater impact on making the digital world safer for everyone if I was doing it across dozens, if not hundreds of companies at one time instead of one company at a time. Now, the reason I give you that background is inclusive in that background since I've come to the solution side has been my participation in the Zero Trust community. I'm a senior fellow in the Zero Trust Institute. I work directly with the founder of Zero Trust, John Kindervag, as well as really the brightest minds in Zero Trust, Eve Mahler, Greg Tewill at CERT, and Dr. Chase Cunningham. And I get to hang out with incredibly smart people on the topic of zero trust. And it's given me a good basis for understanding about fact versus fiction. And I know there's a lot of confusion in the marketplace as it relates to zero trust. So we're going to talk about that first before we dive into APIs and layer 7 application layer and the consequences as well as the implications that zero trust has for that particular part of the equation. Now, I'm going to just brush over the core principles of zero trust. The goal for this particular session is not to be an instructional session on zero trust. It really is to kind of set both base expectations and assumptions about what we're talking about from this presentation. And I think that's the most important part when we talk about these core principles. First of all, as everybody has heard probably endlessly, zero trust is a strategy. It is not a solution. It is not a specific tool. It is not a strictly defined process. It is a strategic way of approaching your security framework and your security architectures intended specifically to stop data breaches and other incidents. It leverages design principles that have been proven to work for more than a decade. And I will just take a moment here, as I mentioned, coming from the enterprise background. In truth, the very core essence of zero trust are ideas and notions that we've had actually for much longer than 10 years. Least privileged access has been around not just for decades, but really least privileged access was the very foundations of access control in the days of mainframe computing, where that was the only compute that was available in the late 50s to the 60s and 70s. A lot of the principles of zero trust have their roots in effective security controls that come from our history in technology and the evolution of technology. It uses a standard 5-step methodology. I would encourage you to go take a look at that 5-step methodology. It distills zero trust down into an easy to understand abstraction that is extremely helpful in moving your zero trust programs forward. It also proves and provides demonstrable outcomes in terms of positive security outcomes, as well as reducing attack surface. Not going to spend too much time on that, but here's the reality. If you want to make conversations about zero trust easy, The goal is reduce and eliminate implied and persistent trust and reduce your attack surface. Those three principles go a long way in moving zero trust programs forward. Currently, though, a lot of the work around zero trust is heavily focused on network layer identity access management, and we're starting to see movement into zero trust guidance. Most recently, even NIST releasing an update to SP 800-27 as it relates to zero trust, where we're starting to begin to see the fringes of conversations and approaches associated with users, applications, workload security, all of the things that really are tightly bound and tightly connected by APIs. So giving a hint about what I'm going to talk about here briefly. Won't spend a tremendous amount of time on zero trust frameworks, but it is important to mention these zero trust frameworks because they drive a lot of the both conversation as well as the debate within the zero trust community, as well as the broader cybersecurity community about implementation methods, frameworks, conceptualization. Obviously, those of you that follow zero trust know that the starting point is Forrester. John Kindervag is an analyst on the ground at the time, more than a dozen years ago, creates a white paper. Out of that white paper springs an entire line of thinking around zero trust as a security framework. That rolls into most recently NIST's adoption of zero trust in terms of creating a standardized framework around that Forrester work. And then there's also this interesting sidecar historically of Google's announcement a few years ago that they had adopted zero trust as their security framework and incorporated that into this notion called BeyondCorp. I do just want to take a quick pause and mention if there's any reason or driving set of circumstances in the cybersecurity community that has led to some of the confusion, some of the anxiety, the agitation, as well as the overabundance of marketing oriented towards zero trust that is sometimes wildly inaccurate. It is this interesting difference between Forrester and BeyondCorp. Within Forrester, the statement is that trust is a human emotion and has no place in a digital network. And BeyondCorp, in comparison, rolled out. You can see this on Google's websites about zero trust. BeyondCorp was rolled out, and BeyondCorp actually in the center of its reference architecture has a trust engine. So we actually kind of can see where the disconnect or the schism around conversations around zero trust, kind of started in that we have one very, very large organization, Google, who is broadcasting that the core of a zero trust security framework is a trust engine. And in Forrester's case, we're hearing that trust is a human emotion. It doesn't have a place in digital networks. Obviously, over time, we'll sort out all of those differences and debates. But I think it's important to understand a little bit of that history. So let's dive into zero trust and API security. And most importantly, why we collectively at Traceable have jumped into this effort to be a part of the conversation around structuring zero trust and associating zero trust approaches to API security, which nets to zero trust for the application layer or layer 7. So when we look at zero trust where it currently stands today, I can say that the conversations, as I've mentioned about, things like NIST, where we've seen a recent update to 827, or a conversation that's going on within the cybersecurity marketplace, zero trust does have incomplete direction as it relates to certain parts of the technology stack or, layers within the security layer stack. First and foremost, there's very little in terms of information or guidance as it relates to the application layer. There's virtually no guidance as it relates to APIs, and as we know, APIs are the fuel that drive the application layer virtualization that we've achieved. This reaching layer 7, knitting together applications, microservices, calls, data sources. outside of the boundaries of perimeters of firewalls and data centers. APIs enable that, and very little in the way of guidance as it relates to zero trust for APIs. Finally, there's a heavy focus on zero trust as it's associated to technology workers. The notions of least privilege access and the requirements for reauthentication or reauthorization, microsegmentation and cost protection networks. All of those types of activities tend to incline towards technology workers, not toward the vast world of all other identities that are out there, whether they're consumers or third parties or agencies or entities. And a lot of the conversations that we're seeing around zero trust are beginning to extend the model into a much broader population. Ultimately, obviously, zero trust's goal is that it's a conversation that's extended across all actors across the entire digital universe. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about how APIs are an attack surface and how big, enormous, ginormous that attack surface is, or what the hacks and exploits of the last dozen months indicate as it relates to API exploits and breaches. But it is worth taking a moment to talk about a few. The first thing that I'd like to mention is a lot of times in conversations about API security, that conversation inclines towards AppSec. Now, I'm not discounting the need for API security, API testing, AST, DAST, all of those good things, being focused on putting high quality code as well as high quality API calls into production. Obviously, it's extremely important. However, it is important to note, as it's reflected on here, are the folks that have been attacked through API exploits, and this is not even an exhaustive list. Missing from this list are Twitter and Uber and a number of other companies. T-Mobile, Optus, MetaBank, Venmo, Shopify, all of these API exploits, none of them have been an application vulnerability. These have all looked like attacks that we're very familiar with: application DDoS, forged credentials, fraudulent account creation, account takeover, actor in the middle, and those are the API attacks that are being successful in today's current environment. While, as I mentioned before, a lot of API security conversation is oriented towards AppSec. This is problematic, obviously, because if we orient all of our thinking about API security to AppSec and shift left, then we miss the reality, as Gartner's saying here. The reality is that there's going to be a 200% increase in API abuses, and API abuses are exactly the types of exploits that I was mentioning: fraudulent account creation, account takeover, use of forged credentials. All of those different mechanics are really where the growth is going to be. As we look at, just the web application service, and we're not talking about internal APIs, we're not talking about third-party APIs, we're not talking about any other class or category of APIs other than those that drive web and app-enabled applications. Gartner called out in 2021 that there's been a 90% increase in the attack surface across that entire distribution of applications. When we start to see high double digits and triple digit numbers as it relates to things like attack surfaces, successful exploits, these kinds of numbers should be grabbing our attention, grabbing us by the shirt collar as it was and shaking us up a little bit. So, one of the things that has been happening within the API world is a lot of APIs and a whole missing tranche of controls, guidance, governance, documentation. In fact, as I'm sure that you're aware, APIs really, from a protocol standpoint, are all over the place. We have, go back to SOAP, we have REST, we have GraphQL, we have very little in the way of standards as it relates to, the creation of those APIs. And frankly, it's created this problem over nearly a decade of the use of APIs in the web-enabled world. Because I'd like to take a pause. Let's not forget that APIs weren't created when the cloud was created. APIs have been around for decades, but they've exploded in use in the cloud-based world. And this created this situation where tons of development, tons of APIs put into production, We're talking about the tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of millions without any of those controls. And this has created a massive amount of API sprawl. So three simple questions that are very, very difficult for almost every enterprise in the world to answer are: how many APIs do you have? Where do those APIs reside? And what are those APIs doing? Now, I don't think that there's any time in technology history, times when we asked how many firewalls rules do we have and nobody knew, how many virtual machines do we have and nobody knew, how many oh goodness, I don't know. How many web applications are your employees using and you don't know? There's never been a time in history where the answer "I don't know" equated into security. Um, every time in technology history where the answer was "I don't know," that meant there were massive amounts of unmitigated risk. So understand that if you are an organization that uses a lot of APIs and there haven't been any of the type of controls that I've mentioned, let alone any kind of security capabilities from a solution standpoint, you have a entire, surface of unmitigated risks that are out there, and you're unaware of the scale, size, magnitude, impact. Right? You don't know how many APIs you have. You don't know where they reside, and you don't know what they're doing. Right? And this is not a recipe for a good security outcome. So as I mentioned, I won't belabor the point, but as I mentioned, API security and APIs are not a technique, a tool, a code that is leveraged only for AppSec, right? You can see on the Tic Tac board here all kinds of different capabilities for APIs to be used for in terms of bad things. And then we're also starting to see compliance requirements come online. Most specifically, FFIEC compliance guidance has come out for banks and financial services institutions, making it a requirement for you to understand not only what APIs you have, but do a risk assessment against those APIs. So these challenges are growing exponentially. I always like to say it this way: if you're not doing anything about APIs and API security today, you need to get moving and fast. If you are doing something about APIs and API security today, you need to move faster. So if there's one thing that you walk away from this session knowing, it's that I want you to, really, really think about the implications of APIs, layer 7, and all of those security challenges that I just showed you on that Tic Tac board, and how those things all kind of knit together to suggest a truth that we're not talking about very much within the security, realm. And that is that APIs are now the universal attack vector. I can now do all the things that I needed to have technical expertise as well as access to assets and resources. I can now do all of the bad things that I used to have, the skills and capabilities and access to get to. I can now do it in layer 7. I can now do it using APIs. What used to take 20, 30, 50 million email clients in order for me able to execute a DDoS now takes me one API and a bot army. Right? And when we think about this universal attack layer, the implications there for zero trust are you can get everything right in terms of your zero trust strategy, the development of your zero trust framework, and then the subsequent implementation of zero trust techniques into your environment. And if you are missing API security at that layer 7, I know that this sounds a little bit contentious, but all of your investment, all of your effort, and all of the energy that you've put in making everything else right security-wise, and all of those other layers or tiers, that has now been invalidated. Because the bad guys can still do bad things, not just at the same scale that they used to by getting into the other layers of your security stack, but by an exponential factor greater. Think about tens of millions of customer accounts being taken in single breaches, which is reflective of what happened with T-Mobile as well as MetaBank. And we're talking millions upon millions of records being exfiltrated in numbers that we just haven't seen before, as well as velocity of exploits. Over the course of a 6-week time period, at the end of last year, there were 4 massive exploits, all using APIs. This is what's at risk if we do not consider APIs in our zero trust strategy. So I've got great news. I sometimes I get a little, down the rabbit hole of concerns about what we're not doing as it relates to security. But there's a corollary or a converse, reality to the statement that I just made, that APIs are the universal attack vector. If they're the universal attack vector, then there is a suggestion there that they could be the universal secure sector. They could be the universal, security plane, if we're really mindful about what we do. Now, it's important to remember that this virtualization activity that's been going on over the last 25, 30 years has led us to a point where we virtualized through all the other layers of technology. And now we're virtualizing across layer 7. We don't build, holistic applications anymore. We bolt together applications with all kinds of different pieces. And in that bolting exercise, the APIs are used to knit those together. And it's important then to consider the possibility that APIs allow that layer 7 to behave like, I'm not saying that they absolutely are, but to behave like the new perimeter and the new core and the new network and the new data store. All of the pieces that used to be, below and enabled the application tier, now all of those pieces have functionality that is reflected in that layer 7. So as most, what you really want to take into consideration is today's API security solutions, absent the zero trust discussion, today's zero trust API solutions predominantly focus on the edge. And as I've mentioned multiple times during this conversation, the edge is just one aspect. If everything was cloud, we'd be great. In the Fortune 2000, I think that hybrid represents about 96-ish%, if not more, of the architectures that are currently being used today, and they are going to continue to be used till long after many of us are gone. So edge is not satisfactory in achieving API security. If it's not satisfactory in achieving API security, it can't possibly be satisfactory in being able to be part of your successful zero trust strategy. Today's cloud-driven applications and microservices, as I mentioned, they're all fully dependent on APIs. So that means that, you're either going to try and one at a time in terms of protecting the assets and applications that are associated with these cloud-based, business problem solvers, or you're going to focus your security on the connective tissue between those applications, which is the APIs. So I know we've talked about it quite a bit today, but obviously, the goal here is to expand zero trust concepts to the API layer. Hopefully, I've given you many, many different things to think about. And then given the realities, obviously, as I mentioned before, if you haven't started on API security, if you haven't started thinking about zero trust as it relates to API, we have to get moving now. Now, in all the work that we've been doing around zero trust for APIs, we have landed on an approach. We have ticked and tied our own product capabilities directly into NIST 827. We've done a tremendous amount of work here to ensure that a zero trust API access approach is providing the right access and the appropriate level of access at the right time, not just to human beings, but to all of the functional and transactional APIs that are also asking for permission to these assets. We focused our zero trust API access on intelligence, threat intelligence that's based on normative baseline, and then comparing normative baseline to actual behaviors to yield, any indications of anomalous behavior. And obviously, a zero trust strategy and then API security, there's a very tactical as well as strategic components in that. So your company definitely needs to be having a top-down strategic conversation as it relates to how you're going to manage, govern, secure APIs, and a bottoms-up approach on how to implement all of the techniques and tools necessary to achieve that outcome. So I won't spend a lot of time on what the future holds because it's just this simple. APIs are going to continue to grow. by factors of hundreds of a percent per year. APIs are going to continue to be leveraged to discover new ways to unlock massive amounts of business value. What I would say about the future is this. It's the Uncle Ben from Spider-Man. With the unlocking of massive amounts of business value comes an obligation for massive amounts of responsibility, right? We orient ourselves towards building security frameworks that are going to be effective in keeping, APIs from becoming a massive problem in relation or in parallel to also being a massive business value driver. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time. I am a resource to the market. Obviously, I have a day job, but I'm available if you ever would like to make contact to discuss anything about API security, zero trust strategies, or anything that's going on with cybersecurity in general. Thank you very much. That concludes the end of our presentation. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you found this session informative and beneficial. Please complete the session survey located within the clipboard icon at the bottom of your screen and enjoy the rest of the conference.